Montreal's Chinatown is the last Chinatown in Quebec. In the 1930s, there were 25 Chinatowns across Canada. Now only 12 remain. Threats of gentrification amidst developers recently buying up property in the neighborhood pose concern for the future of Montreal's Chinatown. I'm Savannah Craig, and you're watching Local 514. In this episode, we'll be looking at the gentrification of Chinatown and how this is not just simply gentrification, but it stems from systemic racism and the erasure of Chinese history in Quebec and Montreal. William Deere, activist, journalist, and author of Being Chinese in Canada, The Struggle for Identity, Redress, and Belonging, has been writing about the gentrification in Chinatown in order to mobilize the community.
When I heard that there were property being purchased by developers, I was not surprised. The only reaction I had was that I was frustrated due to the inability of our community to fight back against this kind of gentrification. I think we've been relying too much on City Hall. We've been relying too much on the politicians who say all kinds of sweet words, especially now, just before the city elections, like they would promise everything but deliver nothing. So for the last few years, I've been asking for a moratorium on energy development in Chinatown. And if we were able to get that moratorium, I don't think a developer would want to waste his money to purchase property, because obviously they purchased this property in order to develop the property, either to tear down the heritage buildings or to renovate. Totally out of character with Chinatown. And so this is, I think, what is happening. It's not just the buildings on De La Gauchetière Street, but also at 1050 Saint Laurent, where there's a developer there who wants to develop that into a commercial space. And of course, we've lost the space at the corner of Viger and Saint Laurent, where there's going to be a high-rise condominiums and hotels going up, and that will totally take away the character of Chinatown.
The Chinese Working Group, a group dedicated to sustaining the history and culture of Montreal's Chinatown, is trying to obtain heritage status for the neighborhood. This would allow for an economically viable approach to development. As a result, cultural heritage and the community of Chinatown would not be erased and continue to thrive. Heritage status has been granted for Montreal and Old Port. Gentrification isn't the only thing that has been affecting the area. The pandemic has affected the neighborhood. Businesses have experienced anti-Asian racism, closures, and vandalism as the area has been isolated as a result of the pandemic. Here's a report by City News from a month ago, highlighting how Chinatown has been affected by vandalism.
News everywhere.
This is not right. To me, this is absolutely, this is ridiculous. It's insane.
A centuries-old residential building in Chinatown is damaged. Senior residents were woken up in the middle of the night to loud banging, only to find the skylight of the building shattered and vandalized last Wednesday. Members of the community are calling for action, saying vandals and racist attacks have been plaguing Chinatown since the pandemic began.
Obviously, 3 o'clock in the morning, they're sleeping. All of a sudden, there was a huge loud noise, like, shaking the whole building. So they all woke up. They all wondering what's happening, and then they heard that a lot of people like running on top of the roof, and they got really scared and they got shaken up.
Chan says it appears as though the culprits launched a bucket of grease into the skylight, breaking through the glass and into the building. He says residents are lucky no one got hurt.
When seniors tell you they're scared to go out because they might be assaulted, or people say get insulted, this is not acceptable in Canadian society.
Every time they call the police, when they come, they make a report in less than 10 minutes and that's it. there's no follow-up or anything because there's no suspects.
We need the police much more visible in Chinatown. The Chinese community says that they want cameras in Chinatown, more cameras, so that they can track down perpetrators when things like this happen. And they also want more police foot patrols in China. The police department has augmented resources, but not to the satisfaction of the community. I've been getting lots of calls from Chinatown saying, hey, people feel intimidated, and people saying there are cases of vandalism. Last year, there was 9 store windows broken on the same night. That hasn't happened again. And now we're seeing this type of, graffiti and breaking of structures on buildings and things like that.
Things like that strike to your neighborhood, and you always ask the question, why us? Why? What's going on? And you always bring that subject back up, repeat over and over again. Now, how are we going to do it in such a way that they won't come back?
City Council passed a second motion on anti-Asian racism 3 weeks ago, calling on a concrete action plan.
The best response to hate is an aggressive pushback. And it's not only saying we're in solidarity with the people who are being victimized, we've got to give them the tools to do this.
In Montreal, Bruna Enriquez, City News.
Gentrification is not new to Chinatown, as development has threatened the area since the 1960s. Deere has noticed how this has affected the area for decades.
When I first came to Canada, my father would bring me down to Chinatown every week. My parents would go down to Chinatown to shop, to buy the Chinese greens and Chinese food, and we would have our weekly dim sum in one of the Chinese restaurants. And so to me, it was a very familiar family atmosphere. And as I wrote in my article in that piece for the Gazette, it was essentially my village. It had a village feeling to it because my parents knew a lot of people. We couldn't walk down the street, either Clark Street or Saint-Aubin or Lagos-Tier, without stopping 5 or 6 times, to greet other Chinese who lived in the neighborhood or came down to Chinatown to do their shopping and socializing. So that was the kind of feeling that I had growing up with Montreal's Chinatown. And then I guess come the 70s and the 80s, when the various levels of government thought it was so easy to take over sections of Chinatown, to roll over the Chinese community, because they felt that the Chinese community was not strong enough to resist the takeover of property and the gentrification of old Chinatown. And so we had the expressway, the Ville-Marie Expressway put in, the Guy Road complex, Hydro-Quebec building, Complexe des Jardins, and the Palais de Congrès, and so on and so forth. And then all kinds of boutique hotels and so on have been put up over the last 20, 30 years. And so we're really at a critical stage at this time. Chinatown, as we know it, is in danger of being extinct, in danger of being completely swamped by gentrification and development by the various levels of government. After my father passed away, my mother lived in Chinatown. She had a small apartment at the corner of Saint-Aubin and Viger. She did not speak English or French. She was able to do her shopping in the grocery stores. She was able to do her where they had Chinese in fact, the Desjardins credit union was in Chinatown at one time, but they shut down and they moved away. But she used to be able to do her banking there because they had a Chinese management in Desjardins. And she went to the Chinese church, and she went to the old age club where she would go daily to meet her friends and play mahjong. So that was her social life. And I would visit her every Sunday and go out for dim sum and talk to friends, and other ladies who lived in the same apartment. And my daughter went to Chinese school, and she would go to her apartment after school, waiting for me to pick her up. So that was very important. It was a social life. And so apart from the social life, it was economically and culturally very important for the Chinese community here in Montreal. And in terms of the immigrants that are coming, I suppose most of them are able to communicate because according to Canada's point system for them to get in, you have to be fairly well educated. But there may be some immigrants who are coming in on a family reunification basis, and many of them are probably in the same situation that my mother was. And so for them, Chinatown is very important. They get jobs in Chinatown if they don't speak English or French. They can speak their own dialect, or whichever it is, Mandarin, Cantonese, Toisanese, and get along and get a good job in Chinatown. Well, not a good job, but at least get a job in Chinatown in order to survive. So Chinatown as a community, Chinatown as a village, Chinatown as a way of life is extremely important to us. People who've been here for generations, the elderly, and also the newcomers.
The gentrification of Chinatown highlights the issue of the erasure of Chinese history in Canada, as Chinese immigrants notably built the Canadian Pacific Railway in the early 1800s. In the century following the railway, the Canadian government upheld systemic racism as they imposed a head tax on Chinese immigrants. More than 15,000 Chinese immigrants came to Canada in the early 1800s to build the most dangerous and difficult section of the Canadian Pacific Railway. They worked in harsh conditions for little pay. They suffered greatly, as it is estimated that at least 600 died working on the railway. Between 1885 and 1923, approximately 81,000 Chinese immigrants paid the head tax, contributing millions of dollars to the government. The Canadian government collected approximately $23 million through this head tax, which amounts to an estimated $1.2 billion in the 21st century dollars. Following the Chinese head tax, under the new act, Chinese immigrants to Canada were completely banned. This legislation was kept in place until 1947, and its effects on Canada's Chinese community was devastating. Deere says the gentrification of Chinatown denies Chinese immigrants' contribution to Canadian society, which highlights racism within Quebec, Montreal, and Canada.
During the fight for redress of the head tax and the Chinese Exclusion Act, and it took us 20 years, a whole generation, to at least to win an apology and a partial redress. During that time, we always said that without recognizing the head tax and the Chinese Exclusion Act as racist legislation, which lasted for 62 years of Canada's history, without recognizing that, then the government is denying our history and denying our contributions and our participation in Canadian society. And so by not defending Chinatown and not saving Chinatown from gentrification, again, Quebec society, Montreal society is denying our history here in Montreal and in Quebec. and not just denying it, but essentially not recognizing our community as a viable, vibrant community that is contributing to Quebec society. Montreal is the last Chinatown in Quebec. Quebec City's Chinatown died a couple of decades ago. So if we don't save this Chinatown, then there will be no Chinatown in Quebec. And perhaps the CAQ government doesn't care. Perhaps to them, it's just as well, because we're not part of the, what they feel to be, historical Quebecois people. Although we've been here 150 years, but perhaps you have to land with Jacques Cartier before you get recognized as a significant Quebecois.
With the municipal elections less than a week away, where do political parties stand on this? Balarama Holness, leader of Mouvement Montreal, proposed a plan to strengthen zoning laws which would prevent gentrification in the area. He wants to propose mandatory consultation with businesses and stakeholders on development processes. He also wants to establish a registry for Chinatown's small businesses, which would provide rent and wage subsidies. In October, the Chinese Working Group sent a survey to Ensemble Montréal and Action Montréal regarding where they stand on the issues related to gentrification in the neighborhood. The Chinese Working Group said that the party's silence speaks volumes. Mayor Valérie Plante said saving Chinatown is crucial. This summer, Projet Montréal released a plan to protect Chinatown. This includes improving pedestrian access from this area to the downtown core, also increasing parks and green spaces, maintaining and developing social housing, as well as supporting businesses in the area by creating a local merchants association. She also intends to encourage initiatives to generate more interest in the sector. The city also wants to partner with the Quebec provincial government to create a working group that will come up with strategies to protect heritage buildings that are a part of the sector. Plant does not want to halt construction in the area, but says that she intends to work with developers to respect the community. But not everyone feels that the mayor has Chinatown's best interest, or has faith in the provincial government in providing support. Here's what William Deere had to say.
I have absolutely no faith in Coder or in Plante. If she gets reelected. I mean, she promised and she put all her eggs in the basket of designating Chinatown as a heritage site. And then just about a month ago, the white nationalist CAQ government refused the motion that was put forward by the liberal MNA, Jennifer Macron, to table the petition that had gathered a number of signatures to designate Chinatown as a heritage site and to hold public hearings. But the CAQ government, who has the majority in the legislature, refused to accept that motion. And I was disappointed, but I was not surprised because the CAQ, as a white nationalist government, has done absolutely nothing, big fat zero, for minorities here in Quebec. And so this is what we're fighting against, this kind of attitude of a government that refuses to recognize systemic racism. Refuses to accept Joyce's principle for proper health care for Indigenous peoples, and so it's a big barrier that we need to cross. And so I'm asking people in our community now that we also have to lobby the federal government, Canadian Heritage, which is supposed to promote and to protect heritage of minorities as well as the mainstream population here in Canada. And so the protection of Chinatown is necessary, is the issue of the day for the Chinese Quebecois community here in Montreal. And so we need to lobby and we need to fight with the three levels of government, the municipal government, the provincial government, and the federal government. So this is where we're at. And with the kind of organization that we have, I think we need to develop more of a militancy to do that. Without seeming to endorse anybody, because I don't have a vote. I don't live in the city of Montreal. I live in one of the suburbs. That's not part of Montreal, so I don't really have a vote. But I do like the policies of Balarama Honus. As a minority person, as a person of color, I think he identifies with the issues and the problems that we have in fighting for equal rights here in Montreal and in the province of Quebec. But I'm just bringing that up because no one else speaks on the same terms as Honus in terms of standing up for minorities.
Local 514 will have a brief intermission. We'll be back shortly.
Do you think that they take residents' concerns seriously? Because it's easy to go see groups, and take them as spokespeople rather than actually making things happen for people who also live there and have a lot to say.
That's it. You know what? So one of the objectives that we have
Good. Oh my God. Local 514 journalist Haute Simon spoke with a member of the Chinatown Working Group, Mei Chu, on the lack of political will to address the need to save Chinatown and the critical state it finds itself in, as well as its historical significance.
Do you think that they take residents' concerns seriously? Because it's easy to go see groups, and take them as spokespeople rather than actually making things happen for people who also live there and have a lot to say.
That's it. You know what? So one of the objectives that we have, because it's not just about the debate, it's not just about getting access to people who are in power, but it's also we're doing an entire we're trying to build a movement in Chinatown. It has many different aspects. It has like the cultural preservation volet objective. It has the objective of economic revitalization, has the objective of responding to social needs and services of the communities and residents who use Chinatown. We want to make sure that vulnerable sections of the community are represented. So this is why we specifically are going to allocate, for example, a space for tenants. We're going to specifically allocate a space for the family associations, and many of those family associations are led by unilingual speaking seniors. We want to allocate a space. Hopefully, like my dream would be to have like a workers representation, because Chinatown and even the country, so-called country of Canada and the province of Quebec is built on the back of immigrant laborers, and that is also a really important element that of the population that we don't look at, we ignore. The importance and the contribution of workers and how important it is for them to be able to have their say in how their rights are protected and what their place it would be in a flourishing Chinatown. Actually, I just want to go back a bit to respond to your question more fully. One of the reasons for not the negligence, but I would say for the dysfunctionalism of Chinatown is that historically, as you pointed out, it's people with more power in terms of like language, in terms of money, in terms of connections that are able to say, hey, I speak for the entire Chinatown, I speak for the community. There is no accountability either towards like the grassroots. So this is why the roundtable and even the debate is important. We want to cut out the gatekeepers. We want to eliminate that function and have develop a type of more direct democracy model to advocate for Chinatown.
Why do you think we are so keen to erase that part? Like erase this when it should be known? Because
okay, this is a really excellent question. No, it's not. It's a question that goes to the foundation of oppression and colonialism. I would say that the broad answer to your question is that is exactly how capitalism and white supremacy works, right? You don't value human beings, you value what profit you can take out of human beings and take out of nature. This is why Canada was colonized. We said we don't need these indigenous peoples anymore as long as we can grab the land. So that's why they were victims of genocide, attempted genocide, and ongoing cultural genocide that's going on today. This is why we imported the Chinese to build a railway, and then once we finished building the railway again, this population of migrant laborers, we don't need them anymore, they're disposable. And this is how the logic of capitalism works, and the way that white supremacy is reflected in all this is that the people who end up holding all the resources, all the wealth, are descendants of white Europeans, whereas immigrants, minorities, people who are vulnerable, indigenous peoples were seen as extra undesirable, unnecessary. Like after our labor has been taken, then we're disposable. As a society, we're choosing to value profit making, even if the profit is just to be concentrated in the hands of a few private individuals. We value that over collective recognition of people who have contributed and who have helped to build the country.
Why do you think there is such a resistance to making Chinatown a historical site?
It's historical, and what we call it is that it's a symbol of living legacies, because the institutions, historical institutions, the associations, the seniors who have lived there for decades, everything is around and in Chinatown. And so the answer to your question is, we had a consultation on systemic racism in Montreal, and this is a really good example of systemic geographic discrimination. We will valorize, white francophone historical places and monuments, but if it's non-white francophone objects or history or people, then that has lesser value, and we can ignore them. Like that's unfortunately that's how the governments have acted.
What do you think needs to be done to preserve Chinatown, especially from people living like outside of Chinatown or not being Chinese or of Chinese descent?
I think, Chinatown has always been a shared space. The red light district for decades used to be right beside Chinatown. Presently, there are 2 indigenous shelters which bookend Chinatown. So I think that there is space for everybody, but I think that we have to be really careful to make sure that whoever is invited or whoever chooses to relocate to Chinatown respect the fact that it is a living heritage site. It's a living memory of the Chinese community in Quebec. We do have concerns, for example, over so-called like hipster businesses that come in and they may choose to maintain a facade, but then in terms of the food or drinks that is served, the people that they hire are totally disconnected from the symbolism of Chinatown. So we are also wary about cultural appropriation. And this is another way that it's more insidious. It's not like destroying a building and building a high rise, but it is another way to encroach and to erase the identity of Chinatown. More insidious. It's not like destroying a building and building a high rise, but it is streets, bordering, between the downtown, the business district, and Old Montreal, and it's such a small space. So of course, we're the organization that first sounded the alarm in over 2 years ago when we saw the huge hole that was being dug to build the Serenity Project. It's like an 18-story. Anyways, it really it's a luxury condo complex and hotel establishment, and they built it like right beside one of the historical arches. So it just like the scale of the development that's happening in Chinatown is absurd. It's totally absurd, and so that's when we sounded the alarm about, oh my God, Chinatown is going to literally disappear in a few decades if we don't take action. So that's why, in response to our mobilization, the provincial government has set up a tripartite committee to look into the tools that we can use to protect Chinatown and designate Chinatown as a historical site. And as people from our organization are lobbying so hard for safeguard measures, so that, between the time that the committee issues its recommendations to the implementation of the recommendations as to how to protect Chinatown as a historical site, that in between that space, that amount of time, that the city doesn't continue to give out development permits regardless of what the projects are, regardless of whether they respect the architecture and geographic and community needs of Chinatown. So yes, we are very alarmed, and we're really lobbying hard for the city and also the province to issue safeguard measures. Like right now, in the very beginning, we had about 2.5, almost 3 years ago, we had launched a petition calling for a moratorium on development in Chinatown, and that was rejected. And now, like 2-3 years later, we have the Serenity building that's up. We have construction going on the One Vigée. We have another huge condo complex on the corner of René Lévesque and like Hôtel de Ville. And so now, it doesn't even give us any satisfaction to say, see, we told you so, because because it's our neighborhood that's being destroyed and being swallowed up by huge mega projects.
If you had anything to add on the subject.
You know what? I think that I'm gonna try to maybe end the interview on positives. Like half my military activism is in the climate change, is fighting climate change, and the more that you read about climate change, the more you read about all the climate refugees who have already lost their homes, and the incredible amount of the lack of political will to address this crisis, which is going to affect all of humanity. It's really easy to be what do you call it, climato-skeptic? No, sorry, that's not the word. To be a pessimist, but that's a luxury that I think people in the North can have, nothing's gonna change. But by adapting this attitude, what you're doing is you're condemning, literally, millions of people to, to destruction and to death and to devastation, much faster. And so I'm gonna end with a more positive spin on the efforts to save Chinatown, even though it came really late. And what I'm talking about is the political will to address the need to save Chinatown, even though it came very late. It didn't happen until so we had our petition in which we had called for a moratorium, but we had also called for a development plan for Chinatown. We asked the city, what the heck are you doing? Why are you giving out all these permits? What is your development plan? And if you don't have one, because we knew that they didn't have one, we want one, and we want one that is drafted in consultation with the community, and we want a cross-section of the community to be represented. And so even though we didn't get the moratorium, we did get a development plan for Chinatown, which was published, I think, sometime last year. Maybe was it last year or this spring? Anyway, it was published by the city, and since it was published, the city did begin to implement it. So, for example, the funding for the creation of a Chinatown roundtable to make sure that we have a healthy, democratic, inclusive way of governing Chinatown, that's going to be implemented, and the funding is already there. We're actually looking for a coordinator. The city already announced that it was going to build a building of social housing dedicated to social housing on Clark Street. So with that is a gain. We're waiting for the tripartite committee to issue its recommendation. It should be coming around the 4th of December. And so, that will give us more tools to continue our campaign to save Chinatown. And so I'm very positive, especially since, the debate forced every single party that was present to commit to a vision of saving Chinatown and recognizing historical preservation, etc., etc. So I'm gonna say I'm positive. We in the past, as you know, we've already lost too much. We lost so many institutions and homes and businesses when the Guy Favreau was built. We're losing more of Chinatown every day, but at the same time, it's just amazing the way that people have come out, people from the grassroots.
Local 514 spoke with people in Chinatown regarding the rapid gentrification of the neighborhood. Here's what they had to say.
What you said is happening here.
I think it's important to preserve the heritage and the history of Chinatowns all around the world, including Montreal.
Because it's after the pandemic is over, it'll be a tourism hub.
Yeah,
there's like we're here, and then we've seen other visitors.
It's important for all Canadians to recognize that Chinatowns have an important part of the city's history, right? Every city, and Canadian history too, right?
Yes.
Yes, that's what I think.
I think that the fact that they don't seem to really care about Chinatown is like they. Wait. We're just gonna wait for the truck to. Yeah, sorry. Maybe it's too far, but like I don't think the fact that they don't like want to make it a historical site, even if Montreal and you said like other sites like that are historical. I think that they don't really take the Chinese communities as seriously, and also well, I personally think that it should be a historical site because, well, if there were no like companies that were buying properties, like I wouldn't mind because it was to be here. But I think that now with all the companies that are buying properties here, and you said the fact that it can possibly be there will be more demolishing of not ancient buildings, but buildings that have a historical aspect of it. Yeah, I think that it should be protected by the government. Just the look of Chinatown, when you look at it, you know it's Chinatown. Like it's really different from other buildings, and it adds to the landscape of Montreal.
Like architecturally, like the architecture.
Like it's really unique and special, and it adds to the landscape of Montreal, and also it kind of represents the fact that Montreal is a multicultural city.
Look straight or no?
You're on.
So how can Chinatown be saved? And how can the community prevent continued construction and gentrification? Here's what Deer had to say.
I think the circumstances of the past few months have made a lot of people realize that we need to take a different tact. Because for the last couple of years, we've been sort of relying and had a lot of faith in the Projet Montreal government at City Hall. But of course, they've done nothing. They refused to accept a moratorium on development. They promoted this thing about designating Montreal as a heritage site, and which actually can only be done by the provincial government, and the provincial government has refused the motion to do that, and so having faith in politicians like what you have in Projet Montreal only leads to a dead end street, and I'm afraid a lot of people in our community have been co-opted by the sweet talk of Valerie Plante. And I think this is a lesson that people are starting to learn. And I hope that people will learn this lesson in order to say that we have to rely on ourselves to save Chinatown. I'm past my prime in terms of organizing. So I'm hoping that some of the younger people with a lot more energy and a lot more dynamism and original ideas will take up the cause, and you may surmise that some of the ideas I have are ideas of an old militant. We tried and true tactics and strategies, but younger people will have to develop their own way of waging this battle in order to keep Chinatown from extinction, in order to prevent the gentrification of Chinatown, because the character of Chinatown will be totally different if we allow that to happen. Young people need to get involved. Young people need to organize. Young people need to reach out to the grassroots and the family associations and support the elderly in Chinatown. And through this process, we can build up a movement. We can build out a movement that the various levels of government would have to take notice. And then we have to take some direct action. an elderly person like me could write articles, which I've done, but we need the younger people to go out in the streets. We need the pickets. We need the demonstrations. We need the information tables. We need to be in the face of politicians, especially around election time. For instance, next year the provincial elections will take place. So we need an organization to develop a plan as to how we're going to approach the politicians. How do we push the politicians so that they can take a proper stand in the protection of Chinatown?
Thanks for tuning in. To keep up to date with the newest episodes of Local 514, follow Local 514 on YouTube and follow CUTV Montreal on Instagram, Facebook, Twitter, and TikTok. See you next time.